Greetings, Bob Fowler here, introducing session number 2 of 5 that we are doing on the provocative parables of Jesus. The provocative parables of Jesus. Let me summarize what this is all about. Contrary to popular belief, the parables of Jesus are not simple stories with simple messages originally intended for simple people. Rather, they are puzzling stories intended to provoke listeners into thinking and asking questions. The gospel writers themselves struggled to make sense of the parables. If we can grasp how they responded to these challenging stories, we can join them in responding to the challenge. So the idea of this class is that, yes, the parables of Jesus in and of themselves are fascinating, intriguing, challenging, but let's take a careful look at the way the gospel writers responded to those challenges. In this session, I want to run through a list of bits of advice for making sense of the provocative parables of Jesus. I have 7 items here I'm going to sprint through as quickly as possible. Advice for making sense of the provocative parables. Number 1, don't be in a rush to find only positive, upbeat lessons in the parables. Yes, they may inform us positively about what the kingdom of God is like, but they may sometimes tell us what the kingdom of God is not like. Are you old enough, as I am, to remember the old 7-Up ads back in the 60s and 70s? What is 7-Up? It's not Coke or Pepsi. It's the Uncola. And I swear many of the parables are parables of the unkingdom of God. In Emily Dickinson's words, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Maybe the kingdom of God is communicated by talking about the unkingdom of God. And then we move forward in a more positive direction from that. I like the title of my colleague Brandon Scott's book, Reimagine the World. Sometimes the parables entice us to reimagine the whole world and not just the kingdom of God, which may or may not be reflected clearly in the parable. Let me say a word at this point about the word kingdom. Scholars are tending more and more to suggest that instead of the old familiar English translation, kingdom, perhaps we should be using the word empire, as in the Roman Empire. This would lead to the insight that Jesus is inviting his hearers to embrace the empire of God as opposed to the empire of Rome. Daring to challenge the empire of Rome 2,000 years ago was risky business. It could get a person crucified. So that's point number 1. Don't be in a rush to find only the positive upbeat, because there may be more going on than that. Number 2, along the same lines, be wary of practicing your own version of allegorical decoding. For example, by turning rich or powerful figures in the parables into God. In Jesus' stories, rich or powerful figures are frequently ruthless, cruel tyrants. I don't want to think that is God. So be wary of your own decoding efforts. Number 3, be on the lookout for the odd, the strange, the weird, the surprising. If something in a parable puzzles you or makes your brain hurt, congratulations, you may be on the right track. That is to say, if you think a parable is simple, easy, and clear, you're probably missing something. The gospel writers struggled. We should struggle too. Number 4, be suspicious of the titles the Christian tradition has attached to the parables or to biblical passages generally. The titles are helpful to an extent, but the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, those titles don't do full justice to the stories to which the tradition has attached those titles. Number 5, ponder, consider the parables, the beloved, particularly the beloved parables that appear in only one gospel. For example, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. Both of those occur only in the Gospel of Luke. Luke 10 for the Good Samaritan, Luke 15 for the prodigal son. We came very, very, very close to losing those two stories altogether because they were preserved in writing only in one gospel that has survived. Imagine how many other stories that Jesus told were actually lost because they were not written down or because they were written, but the writings themselves got lost. Sometimes, this is very rare, but sometimes there are some parables that have survived, but only outside of our familiar, beloved, canonical New Testament Gospels. For example, the Gospel of Thomas. There are two stories, the jar and the assassin. In our live session together, we can talk a little bit, if you want, about the Gospel of Thomas and what is that. It may not be familiar to you, but it was rediscovered in the 1940s, and scholars have been puzzling over it ever since. And it has about a dozen parables in it. Most of them echo parables that we know of from our Bibles. But in the case of the jar and the assassin, those didn't make the cut. They didn't make it into our New Testament. Jesus says the kingdom of the Father is like a woman who is carrying a jar filled with flour. While she was walking on the way, very distant from home, the handle of the jar broke and the flour leaked out on the path, but she did not know it. She had not noticed a problem. When she reached her house, she put the jar down on the floor and found it empty. Jesus says, the kingdom of the Father is like a person who wanted to kill a powerful person. He drew the sword in his house and stabbed it into the wall to test whether his hand would be strong enough. Then he killed the powerful one. Neither of these stories made the cut. They are found only in the Gospel of Thomas, not in the New Testament. And I don't think it's too hard to figure out why. First of all, the assassin. um, and this is a good example of beware of automatically turning the major characters of a parable into God. Let's not think of God in terms of an assassin. That would be reprehensible. That would be god awful. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And so this didn't make the cut because of the obvious offense of a story that features an assassin. But you've got to give the guy credit. He prepares for his job. He's a professional hitman, and he does what needs to be done to get the job done. So maybe preparing for your task is a good thing, but I wouldn't recommend modeling your life after that of an assassin. Okay, what about the woman in the jar? This is a little more benign, but it has some fascinating twists and turns to it. I can easily imagine myself into this woman's sandals, walking down the road with a heavy load on my shoulder, a big ceramic jar full of flour that they've just milled at the mill down the road, and I'm struggling under the weight of this, and I can't wait to get home and hope I don't faint from exhaustion on the way. But lo and behold, I'm feeling stronger and stronger and stronger as I trudge along, not realizing that I'm losing the flour which is flowing out behind me in a big white cloud and is covering the back of my clothing, but I don't know it. And I won't know it until I get home and put the jar down on the floor of the house and find it empty. We love parables of Jesus that end with bigness, with success and happiness. If there's anything, any story that we can take in a positive vein like that, we latch onto it and try to make the most of it. But this is a story about loss. This is a story about loss. Could the kingdom of God sometimes be about loss, be about emptiness? Could it sometimes be about silence? I rather think so. There's a, a, a wonderful theological tradition called via negativa, the negative way, um, uh, the presence of God in absence, the silence of God, not fullness and glory and power, but absence, silence. That too is a part of Christian experience. Think of Job and his frustrations over the silence of God, for example. So I think it's crystal clear why those two stories did not make the cut. Um, I think one last number 7 of my bits of advice. Can you imagine yourself as one of the characters in the parables? This is one wonderful strategy. Imagine yourself as one of the characters in the story. That's a wonderful strategy. I was just imagining myself as this peasant woman carrying a jar of flour down the road, losing it along the way and being oblivious to my loss as I trudge along. A friend and colleague of mine once upon a time made a wonderful suggestion about the prodigal son. That story is not about a son, it's about a father and 2 sons. It's about 3 characters. And often we focus on the story of the prodigal son, his aspect, his piece of the larger parable. But and people love to allegorize the father in there as God, but I think there are big problems with that. And people like to put down or ignore altogether the older brother, the older son. But what if we imagine ourselves from one moment to the next in the sandals of all 3 of those? I think that's a very healthy exercise. So rather than keeping the story at a distance and thinking it has nothing not necessarily directly to do with us, maybe we need to imagine ourselves into the stories. Okay, so those are the 7 bits of advice. Let me sprint through it very, very quickly. Don't be in a rush to find only the positive. Be wary of practicing your own version of decoding. We'll talk about some interesting examples of that in future weeks. The decoding approach. Be on the lookout for the odd, the strange, the weird, the surprising, because that may be the best part of the parable. Be suspicious of the titles. The titles often are unhelpful or not nearly adequate to do full justice to the stories. Lament the fact that some parables appear only in one gospel. We just looked at number 6. We just looked at 2 stories that didn't make it into any of the biblical gospels. They occur only in the Gospel of Thomas. That doesn't mean they're not from Jesus. They could very well be from Jesus. I strongly suspect they are. And finally, imagine ourselves into one of the characters in the story. So, what are we going to do in the rest of this time? together and what we're going to do in future weeks. Let me suggest four strategies of the gospel writers that we're going to look at one after another, beginning today and then in weeks 3, 4, and 5 on down the road. So to understand the treatment of the parables by the gospel writers, pay close attention to editorial differences between the various versions of a parable. If a parable occurs in more than one gospel, you can bounce one version off against another. For example, mustard seed occurs in 4 different gospels. Leaven or yeast occurs in 3 gospels. Treasure occurs in 2 gospels. We'll look at those stories very briefly in a few minutes. In future weeks, then, we'll look at some other gospel writer strategies. The second of the 4 strategies we're going to look at over the course of our time together is the framework into which the various gospel writers place the parables of Jesus. The parables of Jesus circulated as independent, free-floating stories, but the gospel writers have to make a narrative setting for them, a framework within which to place them in their respective gospels. And that is very revealing for how the gospel writers understood the meaning of the parables. The framework of the setting they invented, it reveals their take on the parables. The third strategy we're going to look at is the morals added to the stories. Sometimes, not always, but very, very often, there are lessons or summaries or morals added to the end of the Gospels. Let anyone with ears hear. The first will be last, the last first. Go and do likewise. Things like that are added at the end. Nice tries, nice efforts to boil things down to a simple point, but the stories are really richer than that, and these morals added at the end don't really do justice. And then fourth and finally, probably week number 5, in conclusion, we'll talk about allegorizing interpretations. Interpretations that treat the parables as if they were coded stories, with the challenge being to break the code. And the parable of the sower in Mark 4 is probably the classic all-time example. I will take a careful look at that on down the road. So those are the 4 strategies that the gospel writers practice that we're going to look at beginning today and then in future weeks. Okay, so let me with that shift to an example of difference in wording. And we're going to look here first at mustard seed. Occurs in 4 gospels. That is rare. And let me explain the red ink here. The red is my subjective opinion, my subjective suggestion that this is a version that is less edited than the others. They're typically, if it's red, it's typically shorter than the alternative versions. So I'm going to go with the Gospel of Thomas, the version that ain't in our Bibles. The disciples said to Jesus, "Tell us whom the kingdom of God is like." He said to them, "It is like a mustard seed. It is the smallest of all seeds." Mustard isn't the smallest of seeds, but forgive the exaggeration. But when it falls onto cultivated soil, it produces a large branch and becomes a shelter for the birds of the sky. Uh, where do we even begin? Got to keep it brief. Got to keep it brief. There are so many features of this that deserve exploration. But first and foremost, let's make clear that mustard. We're talking about mustard plants in the ancient world. These are not domestic plants that any farmer would plant in his garden or his field. These are mustard plants in the ancient world are weeds. Think in parallel terms to a nice suburban lawn or a garden behind the suburban house. Your neighbors would look askance upon you if you merrily distributed dandelion seeds everywhere, because dandelions in an American suburban yard, dandelions are weeds. Mustard plants were weeds in the ancient world, and people typically didn't plant them and cultivate them. So if this is about the kingdom of God, the storyteller, dear Jesus, is using an image that right off the bat is shocking and maybe even offensive because you're somehow talking about God in terms of a weed. How about that? Um, in all four versions here, there is some reaching for, grasping for the small beginning, the great conclusion. Um, but it's interesting. Thomas has a small seed to begin with and a large branch at the conclusion. The other gospel writers becomes a great shrub, then it becomes even more a tree. FYI, mustard plants do not grow into trees. This is a wild and crazy exaggeration, but scholars have helpfully identified something that's probably going on here, and that is in the Old Testament, a very, very common metaphor that was reached for to talk about greatness and glory and power and dominion. A metaphor, an agricultural metaphor, or a plant metaphor that was used to talk about greatness was the cedars of Lebanon, great grand trees. Think something like redwoods in California or something. So the Hebrew Bible has lots of images like this of great and glorious plants, but you don't typically start from a weed seed. So sometimes it's just a shrub. Other times it becomes a tree. They're playing. It's hard to tell, frankly, which versions of this language were from Jesus and which were from the gospel writers. I think all the gospel writers are groping for smallness at the beginning and grandeur at the end. So let me say one other thing. Birds of the air. If you're talking about trees, then having birds up there is great. No problem. I love birds in my backyard, in the trees, fighting each other over my bird feeders. I'm happy to feed them seed, but typically a farmer doesn't want birds in his field because they'll eat his seeds. So it's a dubious achievement to create a great sanctuary for birds if you're a serious farmer. So there are many aspects of this story that are potentially quite problematic. Leaven, leaven, leaven. Oh, gee, let me hurry, let me hurry. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast. Let's stick in the word leaven that a woman took and mixed in, literally in, hid within 3 measures of flour until all of it was leaven. Much like with the mustard weed, I need to make the point that in most of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament alike, leaven is a standard metaphor for moral corruption. In the Jewish tradition, there is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, connected to the Passover celebration every spring. And ritually, Jews for 2,000 plus 3,000 years have been obligated to ritually clear out any trace of leaven in their household in preparation for the feast of the unleavened bread. It's a ritual demonstration of a commitment to purity and devotion to God and God's ways and liberty and justice for all and so on and so forth. So leaven is And this is not yeast. It's not baker's yeast that you pick up at the grocery store today. This is leaven. Think in terms of sourdough starter, this a clump of fermenting stuff that you take a chunk of and stick in other flour, and then it leavens. It becomes raw sourdough to be baked in the oven. So leaven is great for baking bread, but ritually, metaphorically, leaven is regularly taken in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament as well as a symbol of corruption. Of it's bad, not good. Symbolically, it's bad, not good. Um, and of course, this is a woman. I think it's interesting that Jesus has no bashfulness about making women the primary characters in his stories. And this is one such female. She hides the leaven in the meal, in the flour. And that the use of the verb to hide, to secrete is provocative. Is she really being sneaky? Maybe. And the three measures of flour, this would make a gigantic amount of dough. This would make enough bread to feed 100 people. This is apparently a peasant woman in a peasant home in the big cities. Rome and so on, in those days, there were bakeries where you could buy your bread. But if you were a peasant living out in the country, you probably made your own. Um, but three measures of flour is a gigantic amount of flour. So there's an image there of greatness, of grandeur, but good grief, that's a lot. And you're going to use a symbol of moral corruption to get to the grandness, the grandeur of great loaves of bread. There are all kinds of twists and turns in that story. But let me move on. Let me move on. Treasure and pearl. Treasure and pearl. These two stories are boom, boom, side by side in the Gospel of Matthew, but they're separated widely over in Thomas. Which is an indication, a reminder that these stories originally circulated independently of each other. But it's probably Matthew who's pulled these two stories together, probably because he thinks treasure can be a positive image for the wonders of the kingdom of God, and a pearl of great value, can be another symbol of the wonders of God's kingdom. So I'm sure Matthew is taking these as positive images, but there are potential problems lurking here. Um, this fellow over in the Matthew version of the story is digging in someone else's field. How do we know? Well, he finds a treasure, buries it again, then goes and buys the field so the treasure will be his. He doesn't apparently tell the owner of the field, oh, hey, I've just found a big pot of gold in your backyard or on your in your field, and I'd like to buy the field. Oh, no, no, he doesn't spill the beans about the treasure discovered. But there's a strange twist and turn with the pearl as well. This is a pearl merchant. This is a guy who buys and sells pearls. Um, but he finds the biggest, best, most gorgeous, most valuable pearl of all time. So he liquidates every bit of his assets, of his resources, to buy the pearl. Then what does he do? He's out of business, isn't he? He can gaze upon the glory of his pearl forever and ever, but who's going to put food on the table? Where's the buying and the selling? It's come to a halt. So treasure and pearl are very seductive as images of one of grandeur, of glory, of greatness, but the guy in the treasure parable in Matthew steals the field. He gets it by deceptive means. He doesn't spill the beans on what's going on. And the pearl merchant gives his whole life to all his assets. He liquidates his estate to buy the greatest pearl of all time. But then what does he do with the rest of his life? Over here, very briefly, very briefly, over here in the Thomas version of the treasure, person number one of three. There are three characters in this story, as opposed to one only in the Matthew version. There are three characters. The first one is the original owner, and he doesn't know that there's a treasure hidden in his field. He dies. He leaves the field to his son. The son never discovers the treasure either. So the son sells the field to person number three, and then he accidentally discovers it while he's out plowing. So no problem there with theft, because person one, person two, person three, none of them knew the treasure was there until the third guy finally accidentally discovers it. He wasn't digging intentionally, he was just plowing. So gospel writers wrestle routinely with the challenges, the puzzles, the provocations of the Gospels. So we can talk in person, those of us who are available to do that. We can talk in person about these things and more. And then in weeks 3, 4, 5, we can talk more about the various strategies that the gospel writers employ to make sense of these rascally, provocative, surprising stories. So thank you for watching. Thank you for paying attention. Look forward to future engagement. All the best. Grace and peace.